Welcome to the Mindful Parenting Podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
Good, good. All right. So you talk about, and I love the way you put it. I think it's such a great way of putting it. Exclamation point kids.
Yes.
What does that mean? What is an exclamation point kid?
Yeah. So, exclamation point kids are our kids and our teens who have big feelings and big behaviors. I use the terminology because I feel like, and parents that I work with have really responded to it, it encapsulates the fact that it's not selective emotions or behaviors that our kids experience. It's really all of them, the full gamut, right? So these kids that have bigger feelings and have bigger behaviors, it's as though they go from 0 to 100. And it's not that they're just kind of sad, they're devastated, right? It's not that they're a little hesitant, they're resistant. But it's also not that they just like something, they love it. That they're not just a little bit happy, they are joyful. And so it's looking at the full spectrum of emotions for our kids and not knowing that it's not just like one particular one that we see a lot of. But often with our exclamation point kids, there are some standout emotions that kind of take the front stage, right? That it becomes a little bit more explosive or a little bit more difficult or challenging to be able to experience or to manage. And so that's where exclamation point kids comes from, is they live big. These are our kids that they just kind of feel it all in really big ways.
That really sounds like me. I was definitely that kid. And then also my daughter. And for me, I've kind of thought of us as like just highly sensitive, right?
Yes.
Like I like feel everything intensely, right?
Yes.
This is why I need mindfulness so much in my
Yes.
life.
Yeah.
And my daughter, of course, feels everything so intensely. And, just exclamation point is a great term for it. Are these, any of, like, I know you have three boys. Are these any of your boys? Are they?
Yes. So I would say, I'm glad you say that it sounds like the highly sensitive, because that's another term for the same group of children. Highly sensitive, deeply feeling, explosive child, the orchid child. There's so many ways to phrase this. We're all talking about the same population of kids. And I'm a highly sensitive person too. And it's hereditary. So yes, one of my three boys would qualify as an exclamation point kid. And I have always said, like, actually what made me think of the term, because as soon as he was born, it's like life got vivid, right? Everything was pretty much calm and go with the flow. And then he came, and it's not that it's just, again, like those more difficult emotions and behaviors, but it's also the really beautiful emotions and behaviors that came out. And I was like, oh, it's highlighted. It's exclamation point. It's a vivid experience. So yeah, I work with families that have one or more exclamation point kids, along with living it out myself.
Yeah, yeah. Did you end up ever apologizing to your parents once you realized what it was like to live with someone like you, as I did?
Yeah, I think, it gave us, this is what's really beautiful about my parents at this point in our relationship, is from the work that I've done and the way that I've talked about kids and everything that has occurred since, they've learned a lot about who I was as a kid. And so it's like we got to go back to that stage of development and have both of us, both sides, have a better understanding of what was going on underneath all of those behaviors and what it looked like on the surface. So I think that's really beautiful, and goes to a lot of what I talk about with parents, is that it's never too late to go back, to make amends, to apologize, right? To heal. We can always have that opportunity in front of us. And I've thankfully been able to live that out. So I could heal things for them as being a parent to me, and vice versa, right? That they have this understanding of what was going on under the surface.
Yeah, yeah. These kids they make you live more intensely and more, and they trigger so much. And so, yes, I imagine for all of us who have exclamation point kids, we do have things to go back and apologize for. I had things to go back and apologize for sure. I wish my dad would, but that's a whole other story. That's a different thing. Okay, so what is happening under the surface? You mentioned that a few times. What is happening under the surface for these intense behaviors?
Well, there's been so much work done on research on the highly sensitive or the dandelion. Dr. Boyce wrote The Orchid and the Dandelion Child
Mm-hmm.
and talks about how about 20% of the population is more biologically reactive to novelty and perceived threat. So, this is a body up biological response that occurs and is not purposefully or willfully done by the child or by the adult or whoever has this trait and this propensity. And so, underneath the surface, there is this really beautiful, highly attuned nervous system that is taking in so much information, more than the other 80%, the majority of the population, taking it all in and then processing it at a deeper level. And the purpose of that is to take care of full species, full population, to make sure that we are always aware, or at least 20% of our population is on alert to watch for any potential threat to save the whole. And
Mm.
so they're like the canary in the coal mine, right? Like they're the first to perceive potential threat, and they can't help but yell it out and be the warning sign. And so when we think about what a gift this is, not only to them, but to us all as humans, we can also think about when we're talking about a 5-year-old who has high sensitivity, how challenging and overwhelming and flooding that gift is in that raw stage, right? And
Yeah.
you know, because you're claiming this for your own experience, we can't be selective. We can't turn it on and off. It
No,
is
no, we can't.
always there, right? And so a lot of times the goodness is seen of that, but that under the surface piece, people aren't always noticing or aware of, but we are experiencing that all of the time. And so for our kids, that is a lot of new data coming in, and that nervous system then gets kind of crammed with that new information. And when there's too much and not enough downtime to
Mm.
regulate and to make
Mm-hmm.
sense of the information, that's when we're going to go into fight or flight. And so all of these big emotions and big behaviors are the dysregulation, the fight, flight, freeze response, right? And they're going to go into that place more often than the other majority, 80% of our kids. All kids experience this, right? They all have tantrums and meltdowns and upsets, and they should. It's a healthy part of development. But the work that I do with kids, it's usually parents coming and saying, well, but my kids do this more.
Yes, a
My
lot.
kids, it lasts longer. My kids, it seems to be anything can trip this off. Like we never know. It's sort of the walking on eggshells
Hmm.
experience, right? We're just never
The
sure what
ticking
the thing's
time
going to
bomb.
be. The ticking time bomb. And so it's really helpful because that truly is challenging, whether you're working with these kids or parenting these kids, to feel like you're walking on eggshells, to feel like any little thing could just set off the rest of the day or the rest of the family. Like that's truly a challenge. But to understand that underneath that behavior, there's neurological wiring, that this is a gift over time that will be used for the goodness of themselves and others. It helps us to be able to manage that then in real time and to depersonalize it, right? That it's not really about us, it's not in reaction to us. They're not trying to give us a hard time, but truly their body is just saying, maxed out. There's a lot of things underneath here that I am taking care of that you have no idea about because you can't see it, but it's very real and I have had enough. So
Yeah.
that's a good portion of what's happening underneath.
This all, I can relate to all of this so much. I wanted my oldest child to be, I wanted her to be able to like take her to a folk festival and just like carry her around and let her fall asleep wherever.
Right.
And, all these different things. And it was like, and if I just do these things from the beginning, she'll be used to it and it'll be fine. And kids just can sleep anywhere, right?
Right.
Yeah, right. Like, no way,
There's like
Jose.
5 different trigger points for her. Like
I
she's not
I
gonna
know.
have it.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
overstimulation,
Mm-hmm.
quickly realized like, well, I realized, of course, I had to calm my stress response. I had to work
Yes.
on that
Yes.
enormously, and I had to work on myself to be less reactive to her. That was, of course, the number one thing. But another piece of it, and of course, that goes into like, of course, that goes in raising good humans and things like that. But another piece of it that you're mentioning here, this like idea of like not enough downtime and this idea of time to process it because they,
Yes.
was looking at simplifying and having rhythms and
Mm-hmm.
routines and having less stuff and having our schedule not so packed, and all of these
Yes.
things were incredibly important. Like when I, and this went into, for the listener, it's in Raising Good Humans. You can find it there
Mm-hmm.
in chapter 8. But I read a lot of it was inspired. I was inspired by Simplicity Parenting, and I really
Yes.
recommend
Yeah.
everybody
Kim John Payne. Yes.
read that. It's so
Yeah.
good. But I remember
Agreed.
the time when she was 2 years old and she was at her Montessori program, and I like totally decluttered her room
Yes.
and I took out 70% of the toys and the stuff. And I was so scared that she was going to freak out.
Yep.
I took her home. I was all nervous and she was like, "Oh my God." And she like
It
played
was
for
like the
three
best thing
hours
ever.
by herself. She was thrilled. It was
Yes.
amazing. So,
Yes.
yeah, I can really relate to the idea that like there's all this stuff we can do with ourselves, but also that need for space and
Yes.
time to process being so important for these kids.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. If we're going back to the fact that this is biological reactivity to novelty and perceived threat, when you're a child, everything's new. I mean, almost everything in life is new. And so that is a constant bombardment of new data to be processing to determine, is this a threat or is this safe? And so, even more than us as adults who have high sensitivity, we know we need our downtime, right? And we utilize that when we can. But we also have scripts and schemas for how the world operates and what we can expect out of it. And we don't have to be as on alert in those situations. But for
Mm,
kids, it is almost constantly new. They are
yeah.
always learning and they care so deeply about being good and about doing it right that can really freeze you, right? If you're taking all of that in. So that novelty piece, and the other is perceived threat. Not actual threat, but subjectively what we feel could be threatening, and not even intentionally, but our body responding to it. And when we pull those things together, we can have a deep understanding why their system might need more respite put in their day. And that respite looks like everything you're talking about. And I'm glad you brought up Simplicity Parenting, because it's like a number one book I recommend. It's not written specifically for highly sensitive children or exclamation point children, but it is so good for them. It feels like that is such a population that benefits from his work on watching those areas of stimulation that we don't even think about, that are constantly present in our children's lives. And so if we can carve out space that is consistent, dependable, predictable, and less
Hmm.
overwhelming, that's going to
Hmm.
give our kids a little bit of an anchor to set themselves down and breathe before they move into the next thing that is new and that is stimulating and that could be potentially overwhelming.
So if I'm a parent listening to this, I'm thinking, look at my schedule, right? Like, look at
Right.
your schedule
Right.
and say, is there predictability? Is there predictable rhythm like we did, weekly meal nights? Is there space? Is there space for downtime, for decompression? Like, if there are back to back activities, there's not going to be that space for an exclamation point kid to process everything, right? So is there that space and time to process things? Those are some of the things I'm looking for here.
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
and when we're looking at that, I mean, everything that I do with my work with parents, it's making sure it's manageable and accessible per family. And so for some of us, we can't make those big overhauls in our schedule, and that's perfectly okay and acceptable. Like we're not looking to all be the same family, right? It's making it work for what we have and what we're aiming to do. And so let's say that our exclamation point kid is the youngest of five, and those four older siblings are going to be full schedule. And so that exclamation point child, who is the youngest, is working to keep up, cares a lot about it, but also gets super overwhelmed by the fun things.
Hmm.
Now, in that family setting, you might not be able or want to eliminate the schedule of your older kids to make those accommodations for the younger. But what you
Yeah.
can do is look at the schedule that you already have and see what types of pauses you can put in throughout
Hmm.
the day that can be consistent in a chaotic schedule. And
Hmm.
those are actually, I call it putting down anchors and having something that is routine and consistent for your kids that they can rely on, as simple as before we leave the house, because maybe a different person takes you to school every day and we can't be consistent there. But before we leave the house, we give a squeezy hug and we fill you all the way up to the top and we kiss you on the top of your head. And we do that every day, no matter what. As an example, some kids do not want to be touched, so don't do that with that child. But this is just as an example of you can make anything be consistent for your family as long as it makes sense for you. You can use the time in the car to make sure there are no devices on and that it could just be a quiet time. There doesn't have to be an agenda in that car ride of making sure that we're talking about the to-do list or I'm asking you these questions, but we can silently have the experience of riding in a vehicle and looking out the window together in the 10-minute ride that we have to go pick up the older sister. And consistently, we're going to do that and just be present with one another. It's finding kind of those micro changes within the existing schedule.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I often when I get in the car as a highly sensitive person, I I sit and we have like this morning we all were like, okay, we're getting in the car, we're going to this thing. And it's like, okay, I sit and I take 3 deep breaths. And my kids are like eye rolling me. But whatever, it's like, okay, now I'm
here.
I am in the transition, I'm taking this next thing. So with our exclamation point kids, they're having big behaviors. What are some of the best ways for parents to respond to the big disruptive behaviors?
Yes, it's a good question. And like the number one question, right? Because these are really large and challenging. It can be really complicated to know how to respond in a moment like that. In taking it apart a little bit, there are 2 parts that I typically work on with families in response to what's going on and kind of the problematic behaviors that they're experiencing. And one is creating a response plan in the moment that you're talking about. But another crucial piece of this is having a preventative plan. And that goes along with what we were just discussing, being aware of what could be overstimulating or overwhelming our child, or because they're the canary in the coal mine, what are they alerting us to? What do we need to take a look at that maybe doesn't have to do with them, but maybe they are aware of in the environment or in the family system? So that's a separate thing, which I'll put to the side for a second. But in the moment, for that response plan, the biggest thing that we can do is believe them. So when we come into responding to our child and their big feeling or their big behavior, we come in with validation and containment. That's kind of like our 1-2 response. And that validation is, I believe that what you're experiencing is real. And even if we did nothing else, even if we don't even say that, but we embody that presence of, I believe you. Because what these kids do experience over and over again is, I'm too sensitive, I'm too big, I'm too much, this is too scary. I will be rejected from this, nobody likes me, I am bad, I'm not good enough. They're all of these kinds of phrases and things that they are experiencing in that moment. And so if we can come into it as often as we can with the presence of, I believe you, that this is real and this is hard. That helps to then bring us into the experience with them so that they're not feeling isolated. And that reduces tension pretty quickly. And it changes things for us. If we can't always. It's not always the expectation. But if we can shift our mindset over into, okay, I am triggered, right? This is really hard. But right now, it's not really about me. My kid, their body, this body up experience is showing me they are going through something authentically hard. And I just need them to know that they are seen in that. And so that validation might be as simple as, oh, I see this has been really hard for you. This seems like it's challenging. There's something tricky about this. Something about this isn't quite going how you wanted it to go. That's actually a really big thing for our exclamation point kids.
Yes.
It's one of the trigger points. It's not going how they expected it to go. Big.
I know it. I know. Still, at 17 years old, it is still a thing.
Yes. Well, and not to fully sidetrack here, but that if we go under the behavior, we can make sense of it because our exclamation point kids are such deep thinkers and they're such processors that they already create full stories, full characters, full ideas and ideals, and they attach strongly to those. And so they always have a plan. Like they're really good at that, right? And oftentimes it's not articulated, it's not communicated. They're not even necessarily aware that that plan existed, but their brain's already taken care of it. And in part because that makes it predictable, right? If our brain can lay out, this is the thing that's going to happen, we can relax here, because as long as it follows that narrative, it's predictable, it is safe. Okay, so all of that then makes sense that across the board, this is a very common thing for exclamation point kids. When things don't go the way that they had hoped, it can lead to a total, like, I lost all sense of self and hope, right? So that's a really triggering experience for them.
Yeah.
And there's a mislabel
Always.
that can happen of they just want it their way. They're just hard-headed, right? And it makes sense because on the surface, that's what it looks like. But this is to help us understand what's operating underneath, what's occurring for them, what is their true experience. And so if we can see that and have that validation of like, this is real and this is true. And if you imagine so deeply that you were going to go to your friend's house, but we never even talked about going to your friend's house, and you can go to your friend's house tomorrow, but right now I said we couldn't. And it just like kind of destroyed you, right? Like logically we get all this, but we're not speaking all this to them. I understand that you really, really deeply imagine going to your friend's house, and that was feeling so good to you that it feels like that's now taken away. It's just the validating it.
It's so crazy because this like explains so much. Like even my brother was like, he's like, like you need to get your way. You needed to get your way when you were little. And like I can see it with my exclamation point kid's sister, her feeling that about her sister, like, oh God, she needs to have it. And I've had that thought about my daughter, like, oh God, it's got to be your way. You know what I mean? And
Totally.
that makes so much sense to just that it's about this prediction and predicting. When if you can predict and expect something to go a certain way, it's a sense of safety.
Yes.
And those are the hardest things for her, when things don't go the way she expected. And yeah, of course that's hard for everybody, but that is really hard. But this is an incredible insight into underneath the behavior that can just help us understand. And then you're saying respond with presence, respond with empathy, with believe you.
Yes.
And that can be so hard for us. We may have a habit of, a parent saying things to us like, you don't always get your way, or, whatever our parents might have said to us, right? Like, and so those scripts run through our head. So put a new script in instead of I believe you. It can take some time. It can take some practice, I imagine.
Absolutely. And I mean, that goes into a whole other talk we could have another time if you wanted to. But when we have that where something wasn't allowed for us to experience or express as we were in our childhood, it can make it a triggering point when our kids do express, like, I am so upset that my plan didn't happen. But me as a child, I was told that, well, you can't always get what you want, and this is really selfish. And, if that was kind of the phrasing around it, then when my kid, any kid, but it's bigger when it's exclamation point kids, when they have big responses to it, it can then trigger that response in me of, this is a dangerous situation. I need to put it out, right? I need to extinguish the behavior. And so that is incredibly challenging in the parent role to try to bring that down, because we're also humans and we also have body up responses that are not willful, that are not purposeful or intentional on our part. And it does take work, mostly outside of the moment first, to be able to respond more intentionally in the moment when there is triggering. And so this is where conversations like this can be helpful outside of the moment, to have us think about and talk about what could be really happening for our child. And can we start to practice that they have a different experience than we have at the same time, and that both are true, and one doesn't cancel out or make less of the other. Right? And so maybe I wouldn't be upset by the situation. And it's very hard because logically, this type of response seems like such an overshoot, right, for what the situation is. And so it can be really hard because I suddenly want to talk them out of it. But I can feel like this isn't a big deal to me, while simultaneously they can feel like this is huge and earth-shattering and I don't know what to do with myself. and both are true experiences. And to make some space and have some comfort with that can allow us to have our own, but then still validate theirs,
Yeah, I
right?
see you. I see you is so it just takes the temperature down
Yes.
enormously to set
Yep.
to be like, okay, you see me, you
Yes.
understand what I'm going
Yep.
through. Whew, has to be a strategy that we use with our exclamation point kids a lot,
Yes.
right? Is
Yes.
the okay, this is really hard for you. I see that,
Right. Right.
and
It's real. This is
yeah,
real.
and simultaneously we have to take care of our own stuff. So
Yes.
sometimes it's like you're having a hard time. I need a second, a
Yep.
minute to like,
Yes.
okay, all right, I'm breathing, I'm
Yes.
lowering it down, I'm doing the deep breaths, I'm remembering to see them and believe
Right.
them, right? Like it's like let
Right.
me
Right.
just
Wait,
turn
what
my
did they
back
say
for
on
a
that podcast
second.
again?
Yeah,
Right. I believe them.
turn
Okay, that's right.
turn
Yes.
your back, take those deep breaths, get your own body out of fight or flight, right?
Yes. Yep.
And then use your brain to say, okay, all right, I can believe them. They're not just that's the thing that it can be hard for us to understand. We're told the story that kids are manipulating us,
Right.
and that's
Right.
simply you're saying that's not true.
It's not true. Absolutely. Like there's not a situation where I find that true with kids. Like I've never come up against that. Their body is doing the best it can to make it through a situation to survive. And so whatever it needs to do that, that's what's occurring. And it's not about doing something to us, the adults. It's about taking care of themselves. And you're hitting on, Hunter, something really important that I wanted to talk about with this response plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the response plan in the moment is validation first. This other piece of it, though, is containment. But I'll come back to
Mm.
that in a second. But all of this we can only do with the awareness of ourselves because this is important for all of our kids. But our exclamation point kids, again, take in more data. They are porous to social emotional cues.
They
They are
feel your
so,
feelings. They feel what
they
you're
feel
feeling, which
it.
is so
They
dangerous.
feel it. Yes. And so we could say all the right things, but if we aren't authentically feeling those
They
things,
see
it is
right through
going
it.
to make, yes, and it's going to light the fire and it's going to make everything worse. And this is the piece of what I work through a lot with families that are so intentional in their parenting and they are working so hard, Hunter. Like they are working so hard at it and doing a beautiful job. But they're like, why, when I try doing it, does it just fuel the flame? Like, why does it get worse? Why do they then start punching me and biting me or screaming cuss words at me? Like, this doesn't make sense. And it's because there's this mismatch, right? And for us to have the awareness and compassion toward ourselves that we are also humans. And so to just be able to do a body scan and see, do I have it in me? Can I fill myself up and get there? Or are we going to survive right now? And that's okay because I don't have to do it perfectly 100% of the time. But to have that reflective part first, and it honestly can take all of 5 seconds, right? To just
Mm-hmm.
scan your body, see where you're at. Do we do, and we have it in us to do everything you just laid out there, Hunter, all those great things, this mindfulness piece of recentering ourselves to be able to approach. Do we have that? And then can we do it? Because if we soften our gaze and lower our shoulders and lower the volume of our voice and get under eye contact from them, those are all the cues biologically that we are safe and we are not a threat. But if we say all the right things like, I believe you, right? Like very intensely, their bodies know what's up. And it's even more upsetting to have a mismatch from the visual cues to the
Yeah.
verbal cues. Okay, so that's where all that spiraling comes in. So it's this 1-2 approach of its validation, its containment, but all of it is embodied with our true authentic presence and being okay that if we can't get there right then, it's never too late to come back and make amends. We can always come back and repair later when we are centered. And there's still a
And
lot
we
of growth
can
and beauty in that.
try too. I mean, sometimes, yeah, like I think it's so much better to be able to take a minute to just get in your own body and center. That is ultimately the best. But then also our kids can, when we're being authentic, they respond to that so well. Like I remember with my intense kid, a time when maybe she was a little older, maybe she was 11 or 12, and she was upset about something and we were in the car and it was like kind of like a demanding in your face kind of moment.
Yes.
And I was like practicing to reflectively listen to her and she's like, you don't even sound like you mean that. But. And I was like, I know because I'm trying not to yell right now because that is what I really don't want to do that, but that is what, is happening. And
Yes.
I really don't want to do that. So this is why I sound the way I sound, like
Yes.
this like weird whatever.
Right.
I sounded inauthentic because I was like, like half my body was like, losing it. But I was containing it in myself. But then I expressed to her how that I was containing it into I was just really honest with
Yes.
her. And she was like,
Yes.
she understood. And it was like this moment of like, I see you as a person, not as a role. And we just like chilled,
Yes.
for a little while in the ride before we addressed the thing. But it was so helpful to just be honest with her and say
Yes.
that in that moment.
Absolutely. And they crave honesty. Again, we
Yes.
all do, but because they feel what's honest underneath, if we are giving them something different than that, what they're feeling, it's incredibly uncomfortable, right? And it can cause an anger reaction to it. And so you did the validating. You were doing your process in that moment and like working those, the scripts that you're like, I'm doing this because it's better than what could be happening or what
Mm-hmm.
has happened or what my body wants to do. So that's a great move, right? And this is progress and we don't have to be perfect. But then there
Mm-hmm.
was this extra healing element of when she, maybe not politely or gently, pointed out to you, like, hey, mom, there's a mismatch between your tone of voice and the words you are saying, right? It's not how she phrased it, but that was the truth. And
Mm-hmm.
she was correct. And so it
Mm-hmm.
is that piece again of like, yeah, I believe you. Your experience is real. And for you to be able to tell her that was like, oh, immediate relief,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
connection. And so I love that example. That's exactly the kinds of things that if we, and what you did, you believed her and her experience. And the thing is, she was right. She was
She
correct
was.
about it.
She was spot on. So
Yes.
there's so much. There's all this obviously our exclamation point kids. They
Yeah.
need us. They're a challenge that they're a challenge for us to step up in really deeply taking care of ourselves, allowing space for both ourselves and our kids
Mm-hmm.
to anchor, as you put it. I love that language. All of these things. There's so much here. But I know we can't talk about exclamation point kids for hours and hours and hours, unfortunately. But before, one of the things I think that is important to have in this conversation is
Mm-hmm.
our extended families. So
Yes.
we have
Yes.
these intense kids, and
Yeah.
our extended families often don't understand how
Yes.
to deal with these intense kids, and they want to shut it down the way they did
Yes.
maybe for us.
Yeah.
So, how can parents help extended families understand and deal with these kids? Besides, dear listener, tell them to listen to this podcast, obviously. But
Yeah.
what
Yeah,
else
have a
can they
third
do?
party tell them. I feel like that's probably like your best route. Just like, here you go. Bye. Good luck.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's so funny, Hunter, because this is one that gets brought up often
Mhm.
and makes a lot of sense because some of this is generational change and wanting to do something different than what's happened before. And then trying to bridge that and bring it back, right? To allow previous generations to have this new information that just wasn't there at that time. And it can be a hard and challenging conversation. So I think the first step in it is actually having confidence yourself in who your child is and in owning any of the terminology that's available when we describe these children. So if it's exclamation point child, if it's deeply feeling child, if it's highly sensitive child, whatever it is where you feel like, hey, this phrase makes me feel known and seen, then you grab onto that. And that's the way that you can describe your experience. And so once we have confidence, it feels a lot easier to approach any difficult conversation because it could be with extended family, but it also could be with our teachers. It could
Mhm.
be with the babysitter. It could be with the
Mhm.
neighbor down the block. Anyone that's having a hand in, having experiences with our kids, there are potential conversations that need to be had. And so if we first feel very confident in who our kid is and who we are as a family, and we're not fearful of their experiences and we're not afraid of their big behaviors or big feelings, but now we make sense of it. We know where it's coming from, and we also know the very gifted side of it. That helps us start to pursue those conversations. So that might be then, let's say that it is highly sensitive child. Like, I like that terminology. That totally fits with my kid. It makes so much sense. Then starting that conversation with, Mom, I got this really great information, and it's helping me really understand Todd. Let's say Todd's my child. And it's called Highly Sensitive Child. And there are all these books on it and all these experts that talk about it. And I just want to teach you a little bit more about what I'm learning, right? Like, invitations to learn alongside are really
Mm-hmm.
great. Or maybe you are really attaching to Exclamation Point Kid because you never thought your kid was super sensitive. You actually thought your kid was like antagonistic and really like kind of angry and explosive. And now you're like, oh, wait, they're all the same. This is just the way that it's expressed in my child. And so, with that terminology, you're able to talk about it with that grandparent. And you could say, you know what? This happened the other day and they got so upset. And that makes sense given, and then the information that we talked about. It makes sense that he'd be really upset because, man, I was thinking about how he had a different person take him to school that day. And then at school, they had a fire alarm happen and that wasn't expected. And then, we had to have a quick dinner on the road and all of these things. So, like, at first I was really upset. But then when I thought back through the day, it made sense because there were so many new things and he processes stuff so deeply that his body was like, I'm done. And so, he had a meltdown in the front yard in front of all the neighbors. And like, that's another approach to it. But either way, these are invitations. This is showing first that big piece of like, I feel confident that my kid's okay. There's
Mm-hmm.
not actually something wrong here, that I'm not
Mm-hmm.
doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I can support them in who they are and their unique experience of just being alive because we're all wired differently. So we start there and then we grab onto knowledge because it gives us power, right? And it gives us understanding. And we can use that to invite them to learn alongside us from our own mistakes and from our own growing. So that's how I would recommend to go about some of those conversations.
I think that's a great, great way of doing it, and have them listen to this episode.
Yes, send it along.
Well, this has been so great to talk to you about Exclamation Point Kids. I think it's so helpful. Is there anything we missed that you want to share with the listener before we go?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for such
There's
a
so
long
many
time.
things.
There's so many things. There are so many things. But I think I just feel for these kids and feel like I know them so well. And I think one of the biggest things, because before starting my work directly with parents and giving workshops, I was a mental health therapist and have been for children and adolescents. So I have had the pleasure and honor of seeing Exclamation Point Kids grow up into
Mm-hmm.
adults.
Mm-hmm.
And so I get so excited because I can tell you that these kids, they're in their raw form right now, but they're the kids who turn out to be the healers and the helpers and the doers and the creators and the artists because they can't help but do things for the greater good. And it is so beautiful to see that flourish. And so I just need that message to be in there too, that this truly is challenging. It's not to undermine that whatsoever. But I get to have sort of this long haul view and understand what comes on the other side, and to let parents know that that giftedness, that operating underneath that surface, that drive and that care and that desire and that deep feeling moves and motivates them to do some of the best work out there. And I am so grateful that they exist. And I am so grateful that they can't help but move to make things better. So there's that whole piece of it too. And we all if we're claiming that exclamation point kid terminology, for us to remember it's not just the challenging big feelings, it's the really beautiful big feelings, right? Like these are the kids that are very creative, that are really intuitive, that are wise beyond their years, that look out for others, right? That create and do all of these things. And so there is this whole other piece that's important for us to look at the full of the child, of like all of this giftedness and the great ways that it expresses itself.
Yes, I love that. Amen to all of that. Jess Trayser, it's been so lovely to talk to you. You can find Jess at her website, parentingfromthefloor.co, and on Instagram, Parenting from the Floor. Jess, it's been so lovely to talk to you. I really, really appreciate it. It's been such a great conversation. I hope it's helped. I know it's helped a bunch of people today. So thank you for coming
Thanks,
on.
Hunter. It flew by. This was fun.